So moving on from flexibility training and training for aerobic fitness or aerobic endurance, we're now going to start to look at the concept of speed and speed endurance. Okay, so we've kind of got some interesting concepts within this, and we're gonna sort of return to concepts of interval training. But my first job is I'd like to talk to you about what we refer to as hollow sprints. Okay, hollow sprints, and I'm going to do this in almost a diagrammatical way. So my first job, I've got kind of my toolbar here that's going to help us. We're going to actually sketch out what a hollow sprint might look like. So if we've got some, I want to imagine we've got some distance over here, and at each point of this, we effectively have kind of a little marker. So we have one here, one here, one here, one here, one here. Anyway, you get the idea. Probably boring you sensors here. And we've got these markers or these cones that actually mark this line out. And we're going to imagine that we have 10 meters for each of these zones. Okay, so 10 meters. And what we're gonna find is we're gonna have a runner. Let's call it you, or it could be me, and we're gonna be over here somewhere, and we're going to be ready to sprint in this direction. And the first thing I'd like you to understand is that when we go through these hollow sprints, we are actually doing what's called a rolling start. A rolling start. So in other words, the run starts some way behind here, which we would call the start line. I hope that kind of makes sense. And generally speaking, what we'd find is that for the first 10 meters, this would be, once we're in motion, not sprinting before the line, but once we hit the line, the sprint occupies the first period. Now, it might be 10 meters, it might be 20, it might be 15, it might be 25. It depends on the nature of the athlete, the individual differences, the specificity, what they're working towards, what goals they've got. But we're going to have some notion of a deceleration in the second area. So I'm going to call it a walk. Now, bear in mind that going from a sprint to a walk is obviously a process. But once we have done that walk, the sprint then occupies the next block. The walk then occupies the next block. The sprint, and you get the idea, then occupies the next block. And finally, if we've got the number of reps that I've included here, may well be different to this. We've got the walk, or it could be a sprint to finish. Now, the thing we would then do is we would have, obviously, a loop back to the start point where we could then repeat the process. So obviously each one of these would be what we would call one repetition. Okay, one repetition. And it may well be that we do a number of repetitions before we complete our set and a number of sets before we complete our overall session. So a couple of descriptive terms we'd like to use. We've already said it's a rolling start. We'd also like you guys to have a good understanding that we describe this as a series of sprints. Okay, so that's how we're going to describe it linguistically, a series of sprints. And you might be sort of thinking, well, where does that word hollow come from? Well, we've got this notion of a separation, okay, by what we call a hollow period. A hollow period. I think you might be thinking, what is he talking about? But in other words, this section here is what we call the hollow section, the period of the walk. This section here is what we call the hollow section. This section here is what we call the hollow section. In other words, we intersperse the sprints with a lighter experience of deceleration and ultimately walking. Couple of last points. I did say a moment ago that we would either jog or walk back to the start. Jog or walk back to start. Okay, so that hopefully will make sense that we sort of highlighted that under here. And finally, I would just like to make a practical point. We've got to think about this in terms of practicality. We live, or at least I live in the UK. We've got a fair bit of open space outdoors. But if we were, for example, wanting to do this in an indoor space, it could be quite challenging. So obviously one of the things you want here is a flat level surface that's going to be reliable to sprint on, for example, and that's not always available. So space, if we are doing it indoors, is a bit of an issue. But of course, what we're going to find a lot of the time is that these things are going to be done on things like pitches. it's a classic example of where this would be done. All right, strengths and weaknesses. Positives, first of all, it's simple. Secondly, it's cheap. This doesn't really cost anything, okay? Markers, cones, I mean, a tape measure to mark out a specific distance, but we're talking about minimal cost. Very, very accessible. But on the negative side, as what I said before, we've got the idea of space. It does take a bit of space to set this up, okay? And there are some other people, I'm going to include this, I'm not sure how fair this is. Some people do argue it's monotonous, okay, or a bit repetitive or a bit boring. I'll allow you to judge that for yourselves, but it's certainly something that's worth considering. Right, tune in for the next one when we look at the notion of accelerated sprints. Thanks.